Welcome back. Today in session 5, we're going to be talking about being connected in service. And we move on to Ephesians chapter 5. And there, toward the end of the passage we'll be looking at today, it says that we are to be submitted to one another in the fear of Christ. And that passage happens at a pivotal moment. It's actually the passage that leads into the section about wives and husbands. And sometimes people miss the first verse of that passage. But it says we're to be submitted to each other. And Paul here is instructing not just husbands and wives, he's instructing the whole church. And as I look through a couple of different versions of the Bible, I find a slight variation in that verse. It says submit to each other out of reverence for Christ in one version. To submit to each other out of respect for Christ in another. Another version says to be subject to one another. And then finally, the version that I think made the most sense to me, the Common English version, it says, honor Christ by putting others first. Or in other words, as the church, we're supposed to serve each other. Yes, absolutely. We serve our community. We serve the world. And part of our focus at Hope Church is to love community. But how can we love the community if we don't love each other? And love is not cheap. Paul uses really strong words. To be subject to each other, to submit to each other, to put others first. Because we honor Christ, because we respect Christ, because we have reverence for Christ. And he says in this passage, not to be unwise but wise, not to be a waster of time, but to use time. And he says not to be reckless, but to be intentional. And he speaks that the drinking of wine and being drunk can make us reckless. And he says, don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. And I hear in there, don't cope with unhealthy things, especially don't cope with alcohol. Cope with what God gives us through Christ, to be filled with the Spirit. And that feels elusive because being filled with the Spirit is not something we can pour and then drink and then maybe do it again. And we need to be careful with alcohol, don't we? I know a lot of Christians express the freedom that Christ gives to be able to drink. There's no explicit prohibition of drinking in Scripture. But man, we need to be careful with it. And if you're a person who has to have a drink every night or every day, I would question whether that's healthy or not. And I would question whether that's become the way that you cope with life instead of being filled with the Spirit. I don't drink, but I think alcohol is meant for enjoyment and not for coping. And the reason Paul states this is that the ways that we order our life can get in the way of submitting and serving each other, and then ultimately gets in the way this church reaches outside of its walls to serve those in our community. And not all of that has to do with wine. Some of it does, not all of it. But in the Leader Guide, Tom Rainier gives the results of a survey they accomplished with unhealthy churches. And he says he found 10 things in common in unhealthy churches. These are ways that the churches were not serving each other, not submitting to each other. And I just wanted to share those. And I want to ask you to do a little mental evaluation as I do. So he found that there were worship wars, that members clash over music styles, instrumentation, or order of service. We don't have that problem at Hope, but maybe we clash over some other things about worship. Which songs, how loud, how soft, the lighting, when the shades are open, that kind of thing. Prolonged minutia meetings, where meetings last forever and we talk about the smallest little things and we don't give people authority to make decisions. He says a focus on facilities instead of people. He says they're program driven instead of mission driven. Check out my sermon from August 4th if you want to hear about that. He says that those unhealthy churches have inwardly focused budgets. Their whole budget is focused on just taking care of their needs. He says that they have inordinate demands on pastoral care. In other words, they expect the pastor and the staff to do all the care, and they don't care for each other that well. He says there are attitudes of entitlement where people have certain positions or places or things about the church. They don't adhere by the protocol that maybe some of the boards would give. They have I stand right here and I greet these people at this door because that's what I do. That kind of attitude is not a servant's attitude. A greater concern about change than the gospel. In other words, let's do whatever it takes to reach people if that means changing. Change for the change's sake of change can sometimes be unhealthy, but he finds that those unhealthy churches. And then lastly, unhealthy churches, there's a sense of anger and hostility in them. Now, we talked about anger last week. But Paul tells us, instead of being unwise, instead of being a time waster, instead of being reckless, he says, be filled with the Spirit. Be filled with God's Spirit. And he says, speak kindly to each other. He says, let music flow from your heart to God. I guess singing's actually important, huh? He says, give thanks. And he says to serve each other. Huge. I hope your discussion is fruitful today. As you did that little evaluation gut check in your mind, where have you seen churches get off track because their ministry becomes more about the personal preferences of an individual or a group of people than it does about submitting to each other, submitting to Christ, and accomplishing the calling and the mission and the goals that Christ has before us. It's week 5. I'll see you next week for our final week together for this session of Grab, Gather, Grow. Take care. God bless.